Thank you very much, Ted, and everybody. It was really interesting yesterday, and an amazing mixture of, I don't know, approaches and disciplines. And I think this probably will also be another of such intervention. I can't, no, let me see, it's going back. I don't understand. So let me go like this, it's much easier. Sure. Yeah, I can't keep my hands off a title, I'm afraid. So it's kind of evolved from the one you have in the program. And I wanted to mention our team, which has kind of shrunk over the years. We've had funding from a number of different sources. And today I'm going to be talking about a string of different projects, just borrowing a little bit from each one. But our team used to be 5 people. We're now down to 2 of us. Alison, who's on this call, and myself. We've had some funding from ESRC, from Europe, most recently from the Environment Agency, and Joe Coles is here on this call that we're currently collaborating with. So yeah, it's been a number of different stories going back over, I'd say, the last, well, since 2007, I'd say. So the question that interests me, I'm going to try and make this bigger. Is that better? So the question that interests me, has always interested me really, is a naive one. What counts as data? And what data counts? What you can see here is a storyboard made by a little girl in Hull after the floods of 2007. And you can see that this tells the story of her and her family being flooded out of their home. And it tells that story in moments which add up to really almost a year of her life. And this was one of the ways in which members of the team managed to elicit the experiences of children back in Hull after the 2007 devastating floods there. And for us as sociologists, as social scientists, this is data. This kind of material here is what we work on, what we work with, what we go on to analyze. I guess normal data, what looks like normal data, tells a different kind of story. So, you know, from that flood, the most serious floods in the UK since 1947, we're told. I'm grateful to Rob, who went through this in much more detail yesterday, that you have a series of numbers like this. So we know that in England and Wales, you know, there are these numbers that were collected at the time. In Hull in 2007, we also know, you know, 8,600 households were flooded, and that little girl was one of those flooded households, and most of the schools were affected. So this is, you know, these numbers tell one kind of story, I guess. But I'm having trouble with my screen here. I'm going to have to. Sorry, it's just not helpful the way it's working. Okay, so is that okay for you? Can you see that screen okay?
It looks just great.
Oh, all right. I'm gonna carry on like this. It seems easier, and also I get a sense of the audience better as well. So, okay, so you know, this is what normal data, I guess, looks like. Ted, so if you could just play that audio clip for us now.
Sure. It will start pretty quickly. So let's see.
Yeah, go straight in.
If it doesn't.
Or maybe just a pundit that you actually always think, is spot on for you. I'd love to hear from you this morning. You can text the show, start with the word radio, send us your message to 81333.
Now, all this week we've been hearing the stories of young people from Surrey affected by flooding. Pupils from the Magna Carta School in Staines have been taking part in a project with Lancaster University to gather the experiences of young people who were flooded out of their homes. They've then worked on drawing up a manifesto for change, which they put to MPs and insurance bosses in Parliament earlier this week. In that, they were calling for better flood protection, but also more advice on what people should do for themselves. So let's hear the last of our series of stories from pupils at the Magna Carta School.
I'm Imogen, I'm 15, and I joined this project because I didn't want my younger siblings and other people to go through the things I went through. It started on the Monday and I came home from school and it just felt like the whole road had gone. It looked like it had been swallowed by water, really, and it was completely covered. And by Tuesday, 5:30 in the morning, the whole road was at least 4 foot under in the deepest areas. We had to go to Thorpe, to my nan's house, and we just stayed there for as long as we could until the water had gone. I think we moved for 3 weeks. It was horrible. No one knew what to do because it was people's first experience at floods. It just looked like it had been ransacked because in an urge of panic, we'd had to get everything we could. I live on a floodplain, so there's always a chance that it could flood again. And especially with the 2013 floods, I know it could. It is really scary. People need to have a plan of what to do, and there needs to be like strict instructions of where to go and what to do and get the materials and things you need. I hoped that we would have an impact, but I didn't expect it to be as strong as this. Just listen to us, really. We've been through it, whereas some people haven't, and we know what we want.
So that's Imogen from the Magna Carta School in Staines, taking part in that project with Lancaster University. It's not the last that we'll be hearing from them. I'm sure they have more developments to come with that project. Obviously, we'll keep across it and bring you updates here on BBC Surrey.
We've all got a penny box, haven't we?
So when the BBC sends you a clip, you get the beginning and end of the clip. That just sounds a bit strange, but you can see there that one of those young people in the picture in front of you was talking about the 2013-14 floods, and this group of young people from the picture here came with us to the House of Commons to speak about their experience. They were invited by an all-party parliamentary group on flooding. And but what I suppose I want to address really is, given that a naive question at the beginning, you know, what counts as data and how does data count? Our starting point was the virtual exclusion from flood risk management, emergency planning, from all these adultist domains of children and young people and their experiences. And so for us, it's how can those kinds of stories that we were able to elicit and collect over periods of time be made to count without reducing them to numbers or reducing them and stripping them of their storytelling value, their what gets called qualitative value. So we've used a number of different techniques once we've managed to elicit these stories. Theatre, which and performance, which my colleague Alison can talk about, who is the expert on theatre and citizenship. This enabling of children to speak directly to Parliament, to expert groups, which are skills they developed through the project working with us. Creating documents to try and influence policy. Documents can travel in different ways, of course. Making short films to allow this direct telling, and then linking with images from their workshops with us and stories to make those stories travel in a different way. Public archiving of, well, gets called raw data. Data is never raw, is it? It's always mediated in some way. But I'll show you our public archive of this material. and then games and sort of online interactive resources which can embody extracts of those stories, one of which enables the participant to walk in the shoes of young people who've been flooded. But I guess the point is, you know, how can children articulate experience of distressing events? That these stories they're not just out there for us to find. They don't drop out of nowhere. They have to be elicited, and it's extremely ethically challenging and complex to access those kinds of stories. And our approach was to take a mix of creative and ethnographic approaches. So here in this picture with the little girls here, you can see us walking along the Humber, and this was a location that flooded through a storm surge, a sea surge in 2013-14, well over Christmas actually, where the sea rose in a storm and flooded the land by 3 kilometers in the dark one night. And it was extremely frightening for the communities that live along that coastline. And so, you know, about 9 months later, when we were able to bring together a group of children who wanted to work with us, we gave each one a camera and we went for a walk. And this is about tracing in the landscape, finding places in the landscape that help to tell the story. And the children chose their own pictures, and later we discussed the choices they made. But also plunging your hands into sand and making models and talking as you go. These were techniques which helped children kind of relax and gain the ability to start talking with each other and with us. So a mix of different techniques. And so what we found was, whilst we were walking, for instance, children would be talking to each other about what happened. And here they're talking about what happened when it was the night of the big storm surge. When it was on the radio, it was only a yellow warning, wasn't it? That means it might not flood. Well, another child says, green means it should be fine, now it's going to happen. Yellow means it might happen, and red means it could be really bad. But it was only a yellow warning. And so children are talking, they're telling a story about how they understood or didn't the warnings that were happening and what those warnings meant to them. So while building models, stories started to come out. And here we learned during this model making workshop about the loss of friendships that children experience when they've been flooded out of their homes. And here it's Ben, who is from an urban area, Staines-upon-Thames, where the nature of the flooding at the same, more or less the same time of year was so different. It was groundwater, surface water, pluvial flooding, and very, very different from the South Ferriby flooding that we saw before. But he tells this story about when we moved, I couldn't go to the park or anything with my friends because they were all so far away. They kept on asking me, but I couldn't get back because my mum wouldn't let me cycle in the dark. Now, without this kind of approach, I'm not sure we would have got that story. We would have been able to then follow this notion of friendship networks and how they get interrupted by being flooded out of your home and having to move away. So whilst modelling, we also got talk of response and recovery, and children were able to use clay to express some of the hard work and emotion that went into the recovery process. And the recovery is the kind of neglected part of flooding, we think. You know, there's a lot of attention paid to response, but very little to the long tail of recovery. So he says, I made the people, so the happy ones for before the flood, when everything's working normally, and then it's sad people for after, because they have to repair everything, and it takes a long time to get everything working. There's that sheer slog of trying to get things going again. but also this idea that well, it's fairly well known in disaster studies that when you're talking to others who have shared an experience or been through a similar experience, you don't have to start from the beginning again. There's a kind of shared language, a shared understanding. And this group that you can see here, many of them didn't know each other before we worked with them in this church hall next to the school in Staines. They were all from different classes from in a really big school, and there hadn't been that collective awareness that others had been through it like me. And so Daniel here articulates this really beautifully. We think everyone in here understands what you went through, so you can talk to them and you know they're okay with listening. Whereas outside, they haven't been through it, because you sometimes feel like if you're talking about it, you're droning on a bit and it's boring them. Whereas in here, we kind of connect a bit more. And this story kind of sums up the isolation that people have been flooded can go through, because they get separated from their friends, they get separated from peers who haven't been flooded, because flooding is often very localized. So that feeling of solidarity doesn't come to them, whereas they experienced it here. And then this ability to start articulating things that happened to you that were quite traumatic. So here, Callum, he says he's moved from they were totally flooded out of their home, and he had to move and live with his nan in a very small space. I could barely move in my room. I couldn't sort of get to sleep. I was so scared, of it falling down on me. All my stuff, mum's stuff, everything in the kitchen, all the stuff from all of the rooms. So everything that had been kind of scraped out of the flooded home had to be stuffed into, that they could rescue, that had to be stuffed into the little flat where they moved, and he couldn't get to sleep in his bedroom. But there's also then the ability to then speak directly to camera, and this is our 6.5-minute film that we made with the children and young people, where they give accounts, but we also do bits of vox pop and other kind of devices to get a sense of how the audiences that the children spoke with and performed with were received. So it's the film is a kind of two-way output, really. But that ability to then start speaking directly to camera, we notice a growing confidence amongst these young people. And the children wrote, when we gone through all these workshops, they said, we think things should change, and they wanted to write these things down. And so we called this a manifesto. How should things be different in the future? How can you help other people not go through what you've been through? And they made all kinds of recommendations, which again have been able to travel in different ways, and we think affect policy. I mean, we're very encouraged by how some policymakers have responded to these manifestos. And then realizing, their citizenship, which, it's rather shocking that the United Nations Charter on the Rights of the Child says that children have the right to a voice in matters that affect them. And yet awareness of this right is so low amongst policymakers and practitioners, emergency planners, flood risk management authorities. But, part of this project was about realizing that sense of citizenship and making that active citizenship visible to adults. So we got all kinds of little stories about how children had actually helped during the flood, rather than being passive victims, that they were actually active members of the community. So here, my village school was the main centre where all the people who were saved from their houses were. Me and my sister and her friend went down to see if they needed help. We just served food and made tea and coffee for the people who were going out and rescuing people from their houses. So this kind of thing started to come out. We started to realize, oh, these are really active members of the community. And then this became more visible. So then another way of mobilizing these stories and making them travel further is by developing games. So back in 2007, one of the adult participants in a project we ran said, oh, recovery is like a game of snakes and ladders. You just go up and down and you get so many disappointments. So this kind of stuck with us, and we ended up developing, using extracts and audio clips from the children's workshops in 2013-14 to develop a game which can now be played online or downloadable for Android. And it's now used in schools and training courses and with flood professionals. And it has a series of stories in it, and you walk in the shoes of young people through the game, through the ups and downs of recovery. And recently, one of the members of the team who has left us now, and I went back to Hull, which was great. And we were able to play this with a primary school year group there. And when we'd finished, one of the little boys drew an amazing picture and just used a little image that we'd put on the picture to create a statement, and we thought this was great, so we put it on Twitter. And another game, Get Flood Ready, which we've made with the help of the Environment Agency, it uses story extracts to build awareness of a flood journey. So this one is very much about going through the landscape and all the hazards and preparations that you need to make along the way, and this can be played online as well. So it mobilizes other parts of the material. And then placing narratives online. So at the beginning, I talked about, not stripping out the value and the kind of qualitative elements of the stories. And that is kind of what happens when you create extracts. So here we've been able to place longer narratives online. There are 4 on these pages here, but also the full transcripts are now archived, and I'll show you the archive in a moment. So Callum's story here, that you saw Callum before, is given in more detail here. And we're currently developing a new project, which we're really excited about, with Chris Skinner from Hull, who I think is on this call from Hull University, and Joe Coles, who's on this call from the Environment Agency, called Help Callum. And it's going to be a game where there are various points in which the audience can be asked, how can you help Callum with the problems that he encountered? And why does all this matter? I mean, for us, it's been about making things visible to adults that adults were not aware of. So things like the loss of possessions is made much worse by the other kinds of loss. So friendship networks, familiar spaces, and a massive loss in education for long periods of time when children are displaced. That children experience fear, anxiety, poverty, sometimes increased poverty through flooding, isolation. They see destruction, they see stress within their families and within their carers. Adults, very stressed with each other. They experience something called uncertainty, and they experience being ignored and misunderstood and treated like victims. They also have, health, detrimental health experiences like lack of sleep, lack of recreation. I mean, we're seeing this at the moment with COVID-19. So, there's been a lot of parallels, surprisingly. And just their insistence that the education system does not prepare them for these kinds of events, that all children should learn about flooding and about risk and about how to keep safe. And so I'm almost done. I just wanted to hopefully play you this.
It feels good. It feels like
Yeah.
we finally have a voice.
Yeah, like we can be heard now. Like
Yeah.
they know how we feel.
So that was just a clip from the end of the film that we've made, and after one of the performances, you know, in front of an invited audience of policymakers, practitioners, emergency services, flood risk people, and we did a bit of vox pop at the end, and these are two of the young women who felt that they'd finally got a voice. So with that, I'm going to finish with this slide, which just explains the archive, the public archive, in which you can access a lot of our data, and you can follow us on Twitter.